better than getting feedback. So in the past we had that annoying feedback. This would just be garbled. I don't know where this review session would air. Well, probably air tonight on the Gateway Channel. And it will probably air on VHS Gator 1 on YouTube. So you can check, and if you can't find that, just type my name in, and the one from 2010 will come up. And that's a good review session. Now, first thing on this review session, or first thing on the test. The test is on chapters 10 through 12. The chapter 10 begins with Washington's ascendancy to the presidency. So, the last part, our last conversation, prior to this unit, was to kind of establish the Constitution, ratify the Constitution. What this unit is about is implementing the Constitution. And it starts with Washington. So Washington is elected to be the first president. The first Congress is elected in November of 88. The first president is elected in November of 88, and eventually by the Electoral College in 89. In April of 89, the first president takes office and is inaugurated. The first Congress takes its seat, and the new government is launched. Now, this is what we said. We said that there were 4 big things that the new government had to do. That Washington, the new Congress, the new officials in this government had to achieve. First, they had to prove to the Anti-Federalists, who were convinced that their liberties were in jeopardy, that their liberties were safe. Second, they had to deal with the financial circumstances and difficulties that existed with debt, with international commerce, or trade, interstate trade, or interstate trade. Thirdly, they had to establish the United States as an independent sovereign nation with the respect of the world. And I think we gave a fourth, we may have divided debt and interstate commerce into 2 parts, did we not? Is that what we have? Do we have a list of 4? What was the 4th one that we mentioned as the 4 challenges? What do you have there? Go ahead, Jack. Oh, filling out, that's right. Filling out the structure of government. So they had to fill out the structure of government. And so our conversation in really much of chapter 10, which was almost entirely about the Washington administration, involved those 4 things. Let's start with this. What was it that was crucial to kind of convincing the Anti-Federalists, who were suspicious of this new government under the Constitution, that their liberties were safe? What was the crucial? Go ahead,
Bill of Rights?
Yes, the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights are going to be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, correct? Who really is largely credited with creating those amendments, guiding them through the House and through the Senate, and eventually through their ratification? Go ahead, English. Yes, Madison. What was Madison in the first government? Was Madison a senator, English, or a congressman in the first government? What was Madison's role in the first government? What position did he hold?
Secretary of State.
He did not hold the Secretary of State. Jack, tell that your ex-best friend, what position did he have? Did he hold?
I forget.
Bobby, tell Jack, your ex-best friend, what position Madison had in the first government. He was not the president, nor was he the Secretary of State.
Secretary of Treasury?
Come on, Bob.
Come on, Bob.
He was in the House.
What's that?
He was in the House.
He was a member of the House of Representatives.
Okay, John.
So he was elected to represent Virginia, a member of the House of Representatives. From that position, as a member of the House of Representatives, Madison is going to guide the first 10 amendments through Congress and eventually push those amendments through the state legislature, and they will be ratified. And this is the big kind of assurance that the Anti-Federalists demanded in order to accept the Constitution. Now, we said in addition to doing that, filling out the structure of government and dealing with the debt problem were important. In terms of the structure of government, we said one of the things that Washington does is appoint secretaries of the departments that had been created by Congress. Congress created 4 departments: the Department of State, the Department of War, the Department of Treasury, and the Office of Attorney General. There was also the Office of Postmaster General. And Washington selected secretaries and an Attorney General and a Postmaster General to help to oversee these departments. And Washington, in addition to doing that, established the practice of meeting with these secretaries and the Attorney General and the Postmaster General for advice. So he establishes the first cabinet. And the first cabinet that Washington established was a formidable one, right? He appointed Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. He appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. This was considered to be a formidable cabinet. Now, with those appointees in place, we said the most significant challenge facing the country was the challenge of finance, debt, and commerce. Now, in terms of that, Hamilton was at the forefront. And we talked about Hamilton's financial proposals, and we said that they involved 4 things. First, Hamilton suggested to Congress in his report on public credit that the national debt be paid or refinanced at 100% of the face value, which was called funding at par. Now, one thing that I noticed when you kids were writing on your essays, that many of you said that Hamilton proposed that the national debt be paid. Not really. He proposed that it be funded at par, which in essence meant that it would be refinanced at 100% of the face value. That the United States not necessarily pay the debt, but make good on the debt and assure the people that held the debt that it would in fact be paid. We mentioned that this seems like it's reasonable. You know, it seems like, okay, look, you accumulated this debt when you were fighting in the Revolution. People loaned you money, foreign governments loaned you money. You pretty much have to pay it back or assure that it will and can be paid back. But there was opposition to funding at par. Dear Allison, why? Do you recall we said there were some people that said, look, maybe we shouldn't do this, or there were problems with it. Do you recall why? Go ahead.
The speculators would buy bonds and rip off the people that didn't know about them.
Yes, what Cage said was there would be speculators who purchased these bonds at way below their face value, and they stood to make a lot of money, by this proposal. Now, this troubled Madison, it troubled Jefferson, but it does not trouble Hamilton. It didn't trouble Hamilton that a significant amount of the national debt would be held by a few rich people who stood to gain a tremendous amount by this proposal. Why not? Why does it not trouble Hamilton? Go ahead, Theodore.
Because they have an interest in the government working out, so their money would be...
So Hamilton thought that it would be good for the United States if the wealthiest and most influential people in the country had a vested interest in the country's survival through holding on or holding part of, or at least the largest part of the national debt. He also suggested something called assumption. How was assumption different, dear Mealy, from funding at par? Well, not the states. The federal government would take over the state debt and roll it into the national debt. And that was troubling to some people, Jim, because some states had already paid back their debt. But beyond some states paying it back and other states not paying it back, what was also troubling, dear Sam, about assumption?
It would enhance the power of the national government.
Oh yes, it would strengthen the power of the national government. What really resulted, we said this almost doesn't pass except for a deal. Hamilton agrees to use his influence to assure something in return for Madison and Jefferson using their influence to get assumption passed. What did Hamilton promise Jefferson and Madison he would try to do? Go ahead, Greg.
To build the
He would try to encourage representatives to decide to locate the new federal city on the banks of the Potomac. Another proposal that Hamilton put forward was a proposal for a national bank. Oh my goodness, that was an extraordinarily controversial proposal. You know, funding or chartering the first bank of the United States was something that Hamilton thought would be productive for the economy. It would provide a reliable currency. It would allow for financing various activities. But there was controversy over whether or not, beyond whether or not it was thought to be a good idea, whether or not it was constitutional. And even Washington was concerned that a proposal to charter a national bank was not, in fact, constitutional. Sarah, do you recall what the argument against the bank was in terms of constitutionality? Go ahead, Lucy. The opponents of the bank that did not want it, that thought, well, this isn't right, it's not constitutional. Do you remember what their argument was? They believed in the strict interpretation of the Constitution. What did that mean most particularly, Jackie? The strict interpretation of the Constitution, what did that mean? So you are saying, dear Jackie, in the Constitution there were a list of enumerated powers that the federal government had and Congress was responsible and had the authority to conduct. And nowhere in those lists of enumerated powers did it say that the federal government could charter banks and businesses. Therefore, if it didn't say it, they couldn't do it, correct? That's the strict interpretation of the Constitution. And that's what the opponents of chartering the first bank of the United States maintained. That while a bank may be a good idea, and many people didn't think it was a good idea, but even if it was a good idea, the federal government did not have the authority to charter banks or businesses. Now, Hamilton believed that the federal government did have the authority to charter a bank or business. What was his argument in support of that? Go ahead, Bobby.
The elastic clause.
The elastic clause of the Constitution. And Reber, under the elastic clause, how did Hamilton make this argument?
Well, in the elastic clause, it states that the government can do anything they need. So he said that creating a bank would become constitutional.
Yes, the elastic clause gave the Congress the authority to do what was necessary and proper in order to complete their enumerated responsibilities. And what Hamilton argued is that a bank was necessary and proper. This idea of the strict versus the loose interpretation of the Constitution is debated over the bank in the Washington administration. The context is that piece of legislation passed the House, it passed the Senate, the bank was going to be chartered, all that had to happen was Washington had to sign it. Washington was reluctant. He wasn't sure if it was constitutional. He asked for the opinions of Hamilton, Randolph, and Jefferson, and they disagreed. And their disagreements over whether or not it was constitutional to charter this bank is what emerged into the loose versus the strict interpretation of the Constitution. Now, at that point, this issue had not been reviewed by the Supreme Court. Now, I know this is jumping ahead, but when and how was the issue of the strict versus the loose interpretation of the Constitution reviewed by the Supreme Court? Elaine. In Mcculloch versus Maryland. What was the issue in that case? It was the same thing, right? It was whether or not the government had the authority to charter not the first bank of the United States, but the second bank of the United States, which was chartered in 1816. So did the government have the authority to charter that bank? And the answer was, in Mcculloch versus Maryland, yes. The government did have that authority under what clause of the Constitution? The elastic clause of the Constitution. You kids are very bright. Now, in addition to, funding in part, assumption, the National Bank, a fourth proposal that Hamilton put forward was for excise taxes that would assist in funding the activities of the government. Remember, even before Hamilton took over as Secretary of Treasury, and without his urging, Congress passed import duties, tariffs, that would provide funds for the United States government, but wasn't enough. So Hamilton proposed a variety of internal taxes, one being a tax on whiskey. And that tax on whiskey is what results in that monumental revolution, the Whiskey Rebellion, that transpires in between 1791 and 1794. And the Whiskey Rebellion is the flat-out opposition of many Western frontiersmen to paying that tax. And that opposition takes the form of harassing people that try to collect it, harassing people that support it, and just outright defiantly not paying it. Eventually, the Whiskey Rebellion is subdued by Washington with a mammoth army, right? An army of 13,000 men marches to western Pennsylvania to make a display of the power and strength of the national government and to subdue the Whiskey Rebellion. I mean, many of you wrote about that in your papers, and some of you thought that was good, and some of you thought it wasn't good. And that kind of reflected what people thought at that time. By the time that Washington had sent those troops to western Pennsylvania, there had been the emergence of two political factions. The Federalists, the group that adamantly supported Hamilton in his financial proposals and the strength and the power of the national government and the Constitution, and the Republicans, who were fearful that under Hamilton and later Washington, that the national government had become too powerful and was intent on trampling on their liberties. And these two groups emerged, opposing each other, and what really begins that is opposition by the Republicans, led by Madison and eventually Jefferson, to Hamilton's financial proposals. Now, and from there, it blossoms, this opposition, this dissension between the Republicans and Federalists. In terms of demographics, a Western frontiersman, would they be more likely to support the Republicans or the Federalists? A Western frontiersman, somebody on the frontier, a Westerner, a farmer, Federalist or Republican?
Republican.
Republican. How about a merchant in New York City? Federalist or Republican, Bobby? Federalist. How about a New Englander in general? Federalist or Republican? Yes. Federalist. How about a Southerner in general? Federalist or Republican? Republican. Virginia, right? Madison and Jefferson are from Virginia. They are Republicans, although Washington, although he never really considered himself to be a Federalist, was a Federalist, as was Marshall from Virginia. Now, we said that, domestic affairs in the Washington administration, particularly Hamilton's financial proposals, is what begins the division of political parties in the United States. But what really heightens that division is foreign affairs. What's the big foreign affair that really takes shape in Washington's administration? Go ahead, Alex. Well, Jay's Treaty is the big action that's taken. That Jay's Treaty is a result of what? What happens? Yes, go ahead, Jay. The French Revolution. Why does the French Revolution present a problem or an issue or a dilemma, whatever you want to call it, for the United States? So what? So what, dear Jackie? The French revolt, and we supported them initially, but eventually some in America cool on it. Why is it even an issue for the United States? So now you mentioned something in your explanation that's important. The issue emerges because Britain and France go to war. And the war between Britain and France starts in 1793 and really doesn't end until 1815. So having this kind of warfare between England and France for this long of a time presents the question of America's status. And what does Washington decide and why? I mean, we have a treaty, as Jackie said, we have a treaty obligation to support the French. But what does Washington decide? Go ahead, Ariel.
Neutrality.
Yes, Washington unilaterally proclaims neutrality. Why, Mealy?
Because if they join with France, then Britain will cut off their trade and basically walk away.
Well, okay, yes. I mean, there'll be ramifications if we would support the French. And say more of those ramifications, dear Ellen.
Washington felt that since our country was so new, there wasn't really an argument to
Yes, I mean, part of that, those ramifications, Neely, were going to become problematic because of the status and condition of the country. The United States was kind of this fledgling Republican government under a new constitution, trying to pay its bills, trying to, establish itself in the world. And part of Hamilton's financial structure was absolutely dependent upon trade with England. If we went to war with England in support of France, this financial structure would come unraveled. I mean, Washington just kind of believed that it was not practical for the United States to enter into a war to support France, regardless of whatever treaty obligations that we had. And so he proclaims the United States neutral. Who does that benefit? Does that neutrality initially benefit England or France? What do we discover? Washington proclaims neutrality. This is very controversial, but what's discovered, Belay?
It benefits the France because we didn't have, our army wasn't good enough to help them. So ultimately, us just supplying them with supplies was better.
Yes. So the French find out that our neutrality actually is fairly beneficial to them. And so how does the British respond to that? That American neutrality ends up benefiting France more than they suspect. Go ahead.
Do they cut off trade with America?
They don't necessarily cut off trade, but they begin to challenge our neutrality, do they not, Sam? And what's the big flagrant thing, Marie, that the British do that just really infuriates Americans? Yes, they start the practice of impressing our sailors. They're stopping our merchant vessels. They refuse to evacuate their northern forts. We suspect the British are encouraging raids on the frontier. So problematic do Britain's actions come in the wake of our proclamation of neutrality that Americans demand war. How does Washington respond to the American demand for war? He doesn't declare war on Britain. What does he do? Yes, go ahead, Sam. Who is this on? John Jay. He dispatches John Jay to England for the purpose of trying to negotiate a treaty. What sort of treaty does Jay come up with? He comes up with a treaty, does he not? Is it a good one? Oh, it's not a very good treaty, it's a very bad treaty, it's a treaty that Washington is embarrassed. But despite the fact that he's embarrassed by this treaty, he does send it to the Senate with his support. Why is that, Kandrak? Why does Washington offer his credibility to such a terrible treaty?
There wasn't a treaty, they ended the war.
Yes, the alternative to Jay's treaty was war. And Washington knew that the United States was not ready for war. Hey, what was the treaty that was signed with the Spanish that gave the United States the right to deposit cargo in New Orleans? Does anybody remember? Alex, you remember? Pinckney's Treaty, right? There may be a question on the test about that, even though we did not mention that in class. Jay's Treaty is, consider this, Jay's Treaty is even more troubling in light of timing. Jay's Treaty was signed and ratified shortly after Washington sent troops to western Pennsylvania to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And so Washington's critics and Hamilton's critics said, well, wait a minute, you say we're too weak to fight the British, so we have to accept this terrible treaty, but yet you can send troops to fight against our own people who are defending their liberties against excessive taxes. And so Jay's treaty and Washington's actions with the Whiskey Rebellion tarnish his reputation to the point where he decides that he is going to retire in 1796. Upon his retirement, he offers a farewell address, Brianna, to the country. In that farewell address, he gives a recommendation that becomes part of America's foreign policy. What was it? Do you recall? Oh, I'll call on Camden if I have to, but Camden, go ahead. Yes, Camden, he recommended the American people stay out of entangling alliances with European powers. Now, upon that, Washington retires, and the first contested election occurs in American history. The contestants in that election are Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. John Adams wins that first election. He defeats Jefferson, despite the intrigues of Hamilton, who tries to elect not Jefferson, but not Adams. Nevertheless, Adams is elected. What's the biggest problem that Adams has in his administration? Go ahead, Greg.
Neutrality.
Neutrality with what country?
French.
Why are the French mad at us? I mean, the French are mad at us. That's why we have to be, I mean, they begin to harass our ships and stop our ships, but they're mad at us. Why, dear Beck?
The Jay's Treaty.
Yes, the French are angry because of Jay's Treaty. And because of Jay's Treaty, they now believe that Britain has had an opportunity to define our neutrality against them. Initially, our neutrality benefited them. Jay's Treaty redefined our neutrality and hurt them. And so they were mad. So they started to harass our ships. What did Adams do in response to France's actions? There's a cry for war, is there not? But Adams is reluctant, Jack, to go to war. What does he do?
He sends like 3 envoys to France to like make peace with them.
How do they make out the 3 envoys that he sends over to France?
He sends them, but they wanted a $250,000 fee, right, to even talk to the.
So they never even talked to the French foreign minister. A bribe was demanded. What's this whole thing called, this whole incident called?
XYZ.
The XYZ affair. And the XYZ affair leads to an undeclared naval war between France and the United States, in which Adams gets the country ready for war with France, but does not take it all the way, despite the pressure of his own party. Adams does not move fully towards a declaration of war. He does sign legislation passed by Congress, though, as a part of that preparation that's a little troubling. The Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts are troubling pieces of legislation that were passed as pre-wartime or wartime measures, expecting the United States to have to go to war with France. Now, most troubling of the Alien and Sedition Acts was the Sedition Act. What did the Sedition Act prohibit on the simplest level, Jackie? It became, as Jackie said, illegal to write, speak, or utter, publish anything against the president or the national government. And if newspaper editors, Republican newspaper editors and others that published things that were against Adams and against the government could be fined and imprisoned, and they were. Now, the Republican opposition, this was an attempt to muzzle them. And clearly it seemed like a violation of the First Amendment. But remember, Madison and Jefferson, now the emergent leaders of the Republican opposition to the Federalist Party and John Adams, aren't in a position where they can challenge this in the Supreme Court, so they challenge it in the state legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky with what becomes known as the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions. What did they say? The Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions. Go ahead, Alec.
It said that states can declare acts unconstitutional.
Oh, Alec, you are saying that in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Jefferson and Madison argued that the final arbiters of constitutionality would be the state legislatures, right? That's what you are saying. Did you want to add anything to that? No.
They were just defining what we were
Oh, I'm glad you added that. That's why I called on you. They wanted part of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, in addition to kind of suggesting at the end of the day, individual state legislatures would be the final arbiters of constitutionality. Jefferson and Madison argued that the Constitution was a mere compact among sovereign states, an agreement among sovereign states. And as an agreement among sovereign states, the sovereign states could define what was or wasn't part of the agreement. So the final say of the constitutionality of a federal law would be judged by the state legislatures. Now, that isn't what transpires. The final say of constitutionality is the Supreme Court. How does that come to fruition? Jumping ahead a little bit. Madison and Jefferson are saying, look, the Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional, and the state legislatures can declare them so. Most people disagreed with them, and an important precedent establishing the Supreme Court as the final arbiter of constitutionality occurs. Cage, in what case?
Marbury versus Madison.
Marbury versus Madison. Does anyone besides Sava and myself remember what year that case was rendered? Go ahead, Sava. What year Marbury versus Madison? Who was the president? This is jumping ahead, I'm sorry. I know, Steve, you get mad when I do this, jump ahead, but it might be helpful to connect them together. It is what year? I'll call on Allison if I have to. Go ahead, Cage.
1803.
1803. Who's the president, Allison, in 1803? Go ahead, Casabo. Jefferson. Jefferson is the president. Now, it is Jefferson who maintained in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that the state legislatures had the final say. And it is Jefferson who really prompts the case of Marbury versus Madison, where John Marshall asserts that it is the Supreme Court that has the final say. Oh, incidentally, in that case of Marbury versus Madison, what piece of legislation, what part of piece of legislation did Marshall declare to be unconstitutional? Boy, this is a good one. If you know this one, Sarah, this is a good one. I don't think anyone's going to know this, but
Judicial Act of 1789.
the Judicial Act of 1789 is correct. You're a super genius. All right, now. In 1800, Jefferson is going to be elected to the presidency. Now, upon his election, he proclaims that the election of 1800 is another revolution. How does he justify that? Why does he say that the election of 1800 is another revolution? What's so revolutionary about it? What does Jefferson suggest that his election and the election of a Republican House and a Republican Senate would do? Go ahead, Matt.
They would make the states more powerful.
Certainly, yes. They would make states more powerful than the national government. They would return the spirit of the revolution to the United States. Another revolution was suggested. We're going to set things straight. And part of setting things straight was to create a weak and unintrusive federal government and to wrest more power in the hands of the states and in the hands of the people. Now, we did say that Jefferson's ascension to the presidency did mark kind of a remarkable moment where the power of government was peaceably transferred from one political faction to another. Very angry political factions. Now, although the Republicans swept into office in 1800 and suggested that they were going to set things straight, we did say that the Federalists had one last opportunity to assert their power. In the lame duck session, before the new Congress was seated and the new president was inaugurated, the Federalists passed the Judicial Act of 1801. What was the effect of the Judicial Act of 1801? We talked about this a little bit. What was the effect of the Judicial Act? Go ahead, Ariana. Well, it created 16 new judges, but let's just go, Jordan, with it expanded the federal judiciary and created new judgeships. It expands the federal judiciary. And with the federal judiciary expanded, what does Adams quickly do that is so darn troubling, Jacob, to Jefferson and Madison?
He appoints the midnight judges.
He appoints people to fill these positions at the 11th hour. They are referred to as the midnight judges. And of course, Jim, who was the most important of the midnight appointees in your opinion?
I'm going to have to pass on that one.
Who will you pass to? Kristen Kuke, you? Yes, go ahead. John Marshall, who is appointed by Adams to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But the midnight judges represent what Jefferson comes to believe is this terrible kind of attempt by the Federalists to go against the will of the people. The people wanted the Republicans to take over. They wanted smaller, less intrusive national government. They wanted the Republican ideology of Madison and Jefferson to be the ideology of the government. And now, in the least democratic branch of government, the federal judiciary was packed with lifetime appointees, lifetime Federalist appointees, which troubled them. And certainly, Jefferson, upon taking office, is going to battle with that federal judiciary. And part of the battle is the case of Marbury versus Madison, which we just talked a moment ago. And we did say that Jefferson had some questions about who the real final arbiter of constitutionality should be. Should it be the Supreme Court or the state legislatures, as he articulated in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions? Now, in terms of foreign policy, Jefferson is going to have some successes and some failures. I don't know whether you consider the Louisiana Purchase a foreign policy. Some of you did not. You conveniently made it domestic policy, which I guess you can do if you want to, is to say that, well, it affected, I mean, one thing that is true, any foreign policy has a domestic effect. I mean, some people made that transition better than others, you know, some people did it very slickly. They said, well, you know, this was, you know, and the reason they did it is because if you think about the three big foreign policy things that Jefferson had to face, one was Louisiana Purchase, but by all accounts, that's pretty good. The Louisiana Purchase results in the doubling of the United States with Napoleon deciding to sell a territory that he recently acquired to the United States at a bargain basement price. What would be the biggest reason why Napoleon decides, after acquiring this territory, look at Jim, now you want to answer. Now he wants to dump it. Why, dear Jim?
Because of the Haitian Revolution.
Oh, say the name of the revolution.
The Haitian Revolution?
Yes, it's the Haitian Revolution. But who is the revolutionary leader of the Haitian Revolution?
The Bon Toussaint something.
Toussaint. Who was in the French class? Say it in French, Cage. You're in the French class. Say it. Who's in French? Go ahead, say it. Very nicely said, Camden. He speaks the French language. Toussaint Overture. Not a picker, we just call it Toussaint Overture. Right? You know, so Toussaint Overture is the rebel leader in Haiti. When the French are unable to subdue them, Napoleon decides that he is going to sell Louisiana. This results in the doubling of the size of the United States. Now, Jefferson does dispatch the Navy to fight the Marbury pirates and has some success with that. Jefferson struggles a little bit when England and France renew warfare and he has to assert America's neutrality. Now, some of you proclaimed that good, most of you proclaimed it bad. The Embargo Act. The Embargo Act was this total embargo on world trade in an effort to get the world to respect America's neutrality. Now, the Embargo Act had some fairly negative domestic consequences, right? It created unemployment and business problems and dissension. It did have the kind of positive effect of prompting American manufacturing. In terms of the Louisiana Purchase, the Louisiana Purchase is a remarkable kind of land deal that the United States has thrown in its lap. But Jefferson has misgivings about whether or not to send the deal off to Congress. Why does Jefferson, who is an avowed expansionist, somebody who definitely believed in expanding incidentally, before you answer that, why was Jefferson such an avowed expansionist? I mean, he was committed to expanding America, to promoting the frontier. Why so? Go ahead, Marie.
He liked farmers.
He did like farmers, and he thought that farmers were like the, I don't know if it's that simple, but the farmers would be the custodians of the Republican experiment. If the nation was filled with farmers, that this would be good for America, it would perpetuate the Republican experiment, it would certainly perpetuate the Republican Party. So he did want the United States to expand, so why, Cage, is he reluctant to accept the Louisiana Purchase?
Because there was nothing in the Constitution about him being able to do that.
Yes, nowhere in the Constitution did it say that you could make such a land deal. And Jefferson was a strict interpreter of the Constitution. But remember, he sets aside his kind of belief and sends it to the Congress anyways. And the size of the country is doubled. Hey, what was the Chesapeake incident, and how did that fit into the embargo? Go ahead, Ken. Oh, so you're saying a British warship stopped an American warship and eventually fired into it? And that's what prompted Jefferson to move towards the embargo? Yes, so the Chesapeake incident was pretty significant. And we talked a little bit about the embargo. Now, Jefferson leaves office. Please give me your attention. Everybody look at me. Jefferson leaves office with the issue of neutrality unresolved. And Madison takes over with the issue of neutrality unresolved. But eventually in the Madison administration, we said that the end of kind of this problem is going to be the United States declaring war on England. So really at the center of the problem between England and the United States was the issue of neutrality. Now there were some ironies in that. The people who most adamantly wanted to declare war on England, the Warhawks, who had been elected to Congress in 1810 and took office in 1811, and who of course was the most famous Warhawk, Jessica, do you recall? You do not recall? We talked about him today, Bobby?
Oh, Henry Clay.
Henry Clay was the most famous Warhawk. Good job, Bob. You're on fire today.
Thank you.
Yes, he was the most famous Warhawk. He was elected for the first time in 1810, became the Speaker of the House, and pushed Jefferson towards war. Most of the Warhawks were from frontier areas. They were not from coastal areas. In fact, most of the support for the War of 1812 came from the West and the South, not New England and the North. And those were the people most affected by the issues of neutrality, which was ironic, which caused there to be some questions. Now, we also mentioned that, when the United States decides to kind of finally resolve the issue of neutrality, there are more issues involved. I mean, certainly there's the issues of Native American raids on the frontier, there's the issue of national pride, but on some level, it's a matter of finally breaking away from our colonial past, right? Did Britain have the right to regulate our trade on the high seas, by doing what they were doing? And many Americans believe the Warhawks led this, that the time had come to assert our sovereignty, and that we had to do that. And this is what contributes to the war. But we do say that when America does decide to go into war, they are divided, with a significant minority of people not wanting to support the war, mostly from the North and from New England, and they are very ill prepared. And as a result of that, it does not go well for the United States on the ground. I mean, the United States invades Canada multiple times without success. And in fact, they even lose territory. The best the United States can do is the status quo at the end of a couple of years of fighting. Now, they do have success on the high seas. The American Navy does surprisingly well on ship engagements and battles on internal lakes like the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain. At the end of the day, the United States is going to end the war with the Treaty of Ghent, and the Treaty of Ghent ends the war on the basis of status quo ante bellum, meaning that everything goes back to the way that it was before the war. And it leaves unresolved the big issues. Neutrality, unresolved. Native Americans, unresolved. But those issues kind of go away. Neutrality goes away because there's no war. Dealing with the Native Americans is resolved on its own as well. In the aftermath of the war, Jackson defeats the Native Americans in the South. In the North, those Native Americans are also defeated. And so the results of the war are that the issues are alleviated, but not directly by the treaty that ends the war. Now, we explained why Americans considered the War of 1812 a victory, because we said timing. The Battle of New Orleans, the most significant battle of the war, the most famous battle of the war, is fought after